On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, setting off the Second World War. After defeating the Polish army, Nazi forces carried out brutal crackdowns in response to resistance efforts. One of their most terrifying tactics was known as pacification operations. These involved mass arrests and executions, targeting entire communities where resistance fighters were active. Around 825 Polish villages and towns suffered these attacks, with victims including men, women, and even children as young as 18 months old. One of the most feared figures behind these atrocities was a German officer named Albert Schuster. His extreme cruelty earned him the nickname the Butcher of Łysogóry. Albert Hugo Schuster was born on February 13, 1912, in Plauen, which was then part of the German Empire. As a teenager, he trained as a bricklayer and carpenter, but in 1929, the Great Depression hit, causing massive job losses worldwide, including in Germany. By the winter of 1929-30, unemployment there skyrocketed from 1.4 million to over 2 million. Schuster's father lost his job, making it impossible to support him financially. In 1931, at just 19 years old, Schuster was forced to leave the state construction school in Plauen, where he had hoped to become a master builder. By the time Adolf Hitler became chancellor in 1933, Germany's unemployment rate had reached a staggering 6.1 million. During this period, Schuster trained as a police officer at the academy in Meissen before continuing his training at the Gendarmerie Academy in Riesa. On May 1, 1933, Albert Schuster joined the Nazi Party and became part of the Schutzpolizei, Nazi Germany's state protection police. A few months later, in October, he was promoted to Wachtmeister, a rank similar to a corporal in the British Army. By October 1937, he had moved up to Oberwachtmeister, the equivalent of a sergeant. After completing a 6-month officer training course in Berlin-Köpenick, Schuster earned the rank of lieutenant in the Schutzpolizei and Untersturmführer in the SS, which was similar to a second lieutenant. At the start of World War II on September 1, 1939, Schuster was working in the motorized traffic department in Berlin-Buch. He stayed there until October 1940 before being assigned as an adjutant to the police president in Plauen. From March to October 1941, he taught civil law at the Suhl Gendarmerie School. Then, from October 1941 to January 1942, he led a platoon at the Fraustadt Gendarmerie School, where he trained officers in so-called anti-gang operations. This training included brutal tactics against partisan fighters who were labeled as bandits and supporters of bandits in Nazi-occupied Eastern territories. However, Schuster's career took a sudden turn when he was sentenced by the Düsseldorf SS and police court to an indefinite prison term for insulting the commander of the gendarmerie school. He served his sentence from January to March 1942 in a building inside the Buchenwald concentration camp's commandant area, but had no direct contact with the prisoners. After completing his punishment, Heinrich Himmler himself ordered Schuster back to Fraustadt, where he resumed training officers and formed the Gendarmerie Battalion. With this unit, he carried out war crimes across multiple Polish towns. Before that, though, Schuster was sent to Belarus, where his mission was to hunt down guerrilla fighters and execute Jewish civilians. In the spring of 1943, Albert Schuster was sent to the Holy Cross Mountains in central Poland. His extreme brutality there earned him the nickname the Butcher of Łysogóry. Schuster led the 62nd Motorized Gendarmerie Regiment, whose main task was wiping out partisan groups. Soon after arriving in April 1943, his unit launched its first violent operations. Instead of using motor vehicles, they traveled in carts to carry out surprise attacks. They were relentless, patrolling the area daily and hunting down suspects. Anyone they came across, men, women, or children, was executed on the spot. Schuster's method of attacking villages followed a brutal pattern. His soldiers would surround a village late at night or early in the morning. The residents were then gathered in one place and separated, women with children on one side, men on the other. Once a list of names was prepared, additional names were read out, and those individuals were handed over to Schuster's subordinates. If someone on the list was missing, his men would randomly select another person, sometimes even more than required. Executions were usually carried out with a single shot to the back of the head. His platoon especially targeted people wearing clothes similar to military uniforms or anyone whose identity was unclear. Civilians were often taken hostage if their family members couldn't be found, only to be executed later. After partisans failed in an attempt to destroy his base, Schuster relocated to a monastery in the village of St. Catherine, thinking that Polish fighters would hesitate to attack a religious site. But that didn't stop his atrocities. Inside the monastery, he tortured and killed around 80 people. In nearby villages, his unit slaughtered hundreds more. Many victims were forced to dig their own graves before being executed. After the massacres, Schuster would often give a so-called final speech, justifying his actions by claiming they were necessary to fight bandits. As a reward for his own cruelty, he would order a meal for himself and his men. Then, in a twisted show of power, he forced the surviving villagers to thank him for sparing them and freeing them from what the Germans called bandits. On May 25, 1943, Schuster led a brutal operation in the village of Wola Ścigiełkowa. He had the entire population gathered in front of the local school and gave them 15 minutes to provide information about partisans. When no one spoke, he announced that every seventh man would be executed. 21 people were shot on the spot. A week later, on June 1, 1943, his forces raided the town of Bodzentin, where they publicly executed 39 men. By the end of June, they reached the village of Demno, killing 28 people, including 10 women. Between March and July 1943, Schuster and his men murdered over 400 people. In one of the most horrifying acts, he burned 2 children alive. In January 1944, Schuster carried out what became known as his Rally of Death in the Opoksno region. As he and his men moved from village to village, they kidnapped, robbed, tortured, and executed anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. Schuster's reign of terror finally caught up with him when he was ambushed near the village of Oyersen by a home army unit. 12 of his men were killed, and he lost an eye in the attack. In retaliation, his forces executed 15 local civilians. By January 1945, as the war neared its end, Schuster returned to Germany on medical leave. Just a few months later, on May 8, 1945, World War II in Europe came to an end. Despite being responsible for the murder of countless Jews and Poles, Schuster was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class and the War Merit Cross First Class with swords. After the war, he was arrested on suspicion of war crimes but was released due to a lack of evidence. He then settled in Raschau, East Germany. However, in 1951, he was recruited as an informant for the East German secret police, the Stasi. But even that couldn't protect him forever. In 1967, a Polish War Crimes Commission began investigating his crimes. A year later, after the findings were shared with authorities abroad, it was discovered that Albert Schuster was still alive and living near what is now Chemnitz. Once East German officials were officially informed, the Stasi cut ties with him. In December 1970, Schuster was finally arrested. His trial began in January 1973. In court, he tried to shift the blame onto the Gestapo, claiming they were responsible for the mass shootings. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. One of the witnesses, Wacław Juba, had a bullet scar on his neck. He testified that he had survived a massacre thanks to an unexpected moment of mercy from one of Schuster's own men. During an execution, Juba was shot, but the bullet only grazed his neck. As he lay on the ground, barely breathing, one of Schuster's men noticed he was still alive. Instead of finishing him off, the soldier whispered, "Lay still." Everyone's dead. At that moment, Schuster suddenly stood up and shouted. Schuster immediately lashed out, denying the testimony. "The witness is lying. That's impossible. My gendarmes were too disciplined for such disloyalty. This is slander. It cannot be true because my soldiers followed their orders exactly, eliminating those forest bandits." But the presiding judge wasn't finished. He mentioned the name of one of Schuster's youngest victims, Wanda Piwowarczyk. She was just 2 years old when Schuster personally shot her while she clung to her mother, crying. After watching the child die, he waited for her mother to process the horror, then smiled at her before putting a bullet in her head. She fell to the ground, still holding her daughter. Wacław Juba had witnessed the entire brutal scene. The courtroom fell silent as the judge turned to Schuster and asked, "Was Wanda Piwowarczyk a bandit?" Schuster had no response. The trial concluded with a guilty verdict. Schuster was convicted of participating in the deportation of Jews from Novogródok, Belarus, and the murder of at least 400 villagers in Poland. His sentence, death. On May 31, 1973, Albert Schuster was executed by firing squad at Leipzig prison. He was 61 years old. His body was cremated and buried in an unmarked grave, erased from history, just as he had tried to erase so many others. There were no tear,